I have a Chiyoko Rokkor 3.5 centimeter, so 35 millimeter f3.5 lens here. This is a pretty interesting Minolta lens. It's one of their earlier interchangeable Rokkor lenses. They made some other lenses before this and some other camera systems, but most of them had fixed lenses. And this is actually a rangefinder lens for the Minolta Super-A system. It's not too practical to use today because nobody actually makes a Minolta Super-A adapter for any modern camera system, but it's still pretty interesting to look at. And if you look at it compared to something like the SLR early Rokkors, like this auto rocker here, the size difference, even though this is a 55 millimeter, the size difference between these two lenses is pretty clear as well. This one's much smaller, and that does make it a little bit harder to work with, but it is a fairly easy lens to take apart. So what I'm going to be doing is to fully disassemble this lens to get access to all the mechanical sections, body sections, optics, and then I'm also going to be disassembling the diaphragm. And that's really the only real challenge of this lens, is that the diaphragm is laid out a little bit differently than a lot of later lenses. And also just, it's so small, it's about the size of a quarter, that it's pretty hard to actually take apart and put back together successfully. And usually it's not necessary, so I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Looking here at the lens, just to explain a little bit more about this, since it looks kind of odd compared to a lot of the other camera lenses here. This is where the mount would normally go, up here, the Minolta Super-A bayonet mount. Then you would lock it onto your camera. The inner part of the lens here is what actually spins around to focus back and forth. So if I grab this back section here, that's focusing back and forth. And then the aperture control is on this upper part right here. So there's kind of a silver ring you can spin around with the inner section fixed, which then controls the aperture. All right, so now we'll start on the disassembly here. And to start off, we're going to remove the mounting plate ring going around here. So the mounting plate is just held in place by 5 little silver slotted screws going around on the exterior here. This camera lens does use slotted screws exclusively. And this allows us to just remove the mounting plate here from the inner part of the camera, which houses all the interesting parts, so the focusing mechanism and the optics, diaphragm, all that. This mounting plate section has the bayonet mount, which you can spin back and forth to, I believe, lock it onto the camera, but that's really not too interesting. You can clean this piece pretty well on its own in its current state. So here's where all the main part of the lens is happening. The focusing mechanism is very tiny, and it's right up here. You can see that normally this part right here, this kind of brass colored section, would be locked in place, and it kind of screws up and down on this mechanism in here, and that's providing the focusing mechanism. So next up here, we're going to start removing some of the front elements here to get access to the diaphragm mechanism on its own and get it out from this main housing. So on the back of the lens here, first off, there are these 2 little slotted screws going in here on this metal plate going around. And these are just locking this metal plate in place so it doesn't spin around. So we'll undo these 2. All right, so we got those 2 little set screws, and now this metal plate on the back section will just unscrew. And now just lift off the focusing mechanism right here. It also has the aperture control indicators on it. And now we have separated the diaphragm mechanism and the optics from the rest of the lens. There's also this little ring right there, which goes onto the diaphragm in the back, so I'll just remove that as well for the moment. At this stage, now we're going to start going in from the front of the lens, get access to some of the, get access to the front of the diaphragm. So we want to remove the black name ring that's going around here first off, and it has 2 little divots for a spanning wrench on either side, there and there. And now there's another little ring a little bit further recessed down in the lens, this other brass colored ring that also has 2 little divots for a spanning wrench. And this is what's locking the this big silver top section here into the lens itself. So undo this as well. This piece also contains the front optics. And one thing to note is that once you remove this piece in the front optics, you're exposing the diaphragm. So we have the piece here with the front optics. And the only problem with exposing the diaphragm is that there's this little plate on the top, and this plate is really not very secure, at least in my copy of this lens. So if you tilt this upside down at this point, the diaphragm blades will fall out of place, which is really, it can make it hard to actually take apart and clean this lens if you don't really want to disassemble the entire diaphragm, because it can really easily fall out of place. And at this stage, we can also remove the silver ring that's actually the one that's coupling in the aperture control into the diaphragm mechanism. So just being careful not to tilt the lens too far over. Looking here at the side, one thing is on the silver ring, there's nothing holding it in place right now, but there is the ball bearing that makes the clicking sound as you rotate it back and forth. Because my copy of the lens is pretty old, the ball bearing doesn't really click so much anymore, but it's actually over on this part of the lens right here. You can see there are these little tiny dots that the ball bearing is going to go into, and then the ball bearing itself is held in place right here, so under this metal flap. So just be careful when taking this apart that you don't lose the ball bearing. So I'm just going to slide this out. Okay, and then there's the ball bearing right there in the pocket, so I'll remove that as well. Separate these two pieces. And now we have the diaphragm here and the back of the lens. So one thing about this is that I wasn't able to find a way to separate the back lens elements from the diaphragm fully. So this is as far as I was able to take apart the lens for just a normal disassembly, but now I'm actually going to take apart the diaphragm. And you can actually see that I messed up at one point and didn't hold in the top diaphragm plate here. So it's now out of position, and you can tell that because the little posts in here, there should be two visible over here, and they've slid under here. So if I actually try to turn this back and forth, nothing is going to happen. Now I'm just going to reposition this to kind of demonstrate how the diaphragm should work. If this does happen to you, you can often get the blades back into position just by nudging the little posts back and forth here. So that's what I've done. And now the diaphragm is working again. And the actual diaphragm control post is over on this side here. It's just rotating this top plate around while the bottom plate is fixed. So looking here at the diaphragm, you can see that it has quite a few blades in there. So it's a little bit more complex, and the blades themselves are pretty small. And one interesting thing is that as it closes, it kind of creates this neat star-shaped pattern in there. So it doesn't form a perfect even-sided figure until it's very far closed, or it's pretty far open as well. So now let's actually take apart the diaphragm by removing first this little post on the side. It just is a little slotted screw that goes in place here. This will allow us to remove the top of the diaphragm plate. One thing about this lens is because the diaphragm is directly controlled by something on the exterior of the lens, it's not being hooked in with like a spring or one of those things. Usually you don't need to take apart the diaphragm unless you need to clean the optic better under it, on this lens in particular. Because I couldn't find out how to actually get access to the back optic here on its own, removing the diaphragm is the only way I found to actually get to that back optic fully. But for most normal cases, you'd be able to clean it just in this normal state here. But it is interesting to take apart, and it has a kind of interesting setup. So now I'm going to just remove this top plate, and now the diaphragm blades are loose in the lens, and I'll just dump them all out here. And there's a little plate on the back as well. You can see that if I just put up a quarter here for size comparisons, the diaphragm is about the size of a quarter, and then all the blades are pretty small as well, so that does make putting it back together a little bit more difficult than on some other lenses, especially on the Minolta SLR 50mm lenses where the diaphragm blades are a pretty good size and you can work with them easily. But if we take a look here at one of the diaphragm blades, you also notice a pretty significant difference in how this is constructed. You can see that it has kind of a V-shaped blade, and these actually interlock to form the aperture in a kind of interesting way, as we'll see when we put this back together. Alright, so that has the lens all disassembled here. Got the diaphragm and all the little blades over here. And you can see that the lens itself doesn't have too many components. It's a pretty simple design mechanically and internally, and it uses all high quality metal components, which makes taking it apart pretty easy. The slotted screws can get stripped, and on some of mine they are a little bit stripped just because of age and things, so that is something to watch out for. But other than that, it's easy to take apart this lens and get access to things. Now to start on the reassembly of the lens, we have to start off now with the diaphragm. So the way that the diaphragm is going to work is, first off, there's this plate here that we took out before. So the diaphragm housing is right back here with the back optics, and this plate is going to sit down in there. There's these two screws going in from the back right here that actually are protruding out right in this section, and this plate has two little cutouts on either side right here, which go on top of those screws. So here, I've kind of gone in here and I'll just put this in place first. Found where the plate goes on top of the two screws here, and then also noted where the slot for the diaphragm control lever is, and marked out one extreme end of that on the plate itself with just a little pencil mark right there. That will help line things up later. So now to actually start getting the blades in place. So each blade here, if we look at it a little bit more detail, it's a V-shaped piece, but you can see that one side is a little bit smaller and then there's a heavier side as well. So this side is smaller and this side is heavier, and you can also identify them because the heavier side has kind of an odd indentation right here, whereas this side has more of a flat edge. So the smaller side is what's actually going to go on the bottom of that plate. The upper side is what's going to lock into the top section here that we took out before, and the part that rotates back and forth. So the challenge here is that these blades have to overlap correctly, just because of how they're shaped, it can be difficult to properly overlap them without dislodging previous blades that you put in place, and without getting them locked into the wrong position. So I'll just grab the diaphragm ring here and the first blade. So I've grabbed it from the heavier side, and I'm just going to position the little post here down in any slot. But I'm going to start off by positioning it kind of off to the side so it isn't actually going onto the ring. And just get the edge started on the ring over here. So that will help with overlapping things later. Next up, I'll grab the next blade here and just set it right on top of this previous one. Do kind of the same thing, but a little bit further in. The reason I'm doing the reason that these are not going directly onto the ring at this point is that you need to leave these holes over here exposed so that the final blades can actually go into the correct positions. Once you get past the first couple of blades, though, that's not necessary. So with the third blade here, I can actually just drop it right in place and get it into its final position where it's going to go with the edge kind of onto the ring exterior over there. Just want to make sure that the two original holes that were not filled are still accessible. So I'll just continue doing that with the next couple of blades here. Now for these final two blades, here's where things start to overlap. So the first one's not too bad because we left the first couple of blades off to the side here, so it can just go in place easily. And this last one is the most difficult because it has to go under the first two blades and then on top of the last one that we put in. So I'm just going to spin this around, slide this under the first two. And I kind of have to lift the first blade now on top of this last one to get these to overlap correctly. So one thing that can happen, which has actually happened right now, is that the V-shaped section, the bottom of the V, can get caught on the end of the blades. So if that happens, you have to kind of back up the blade a little bit Make sure to lift it fully on top of the other one. Okay, so now I have all the blades correctly overlapping, and I'm just wanting to go around and position all the blades so that the edges line up with the edge of that disc below. And once you have those properly lined up, you should also be able to see that the little posts here are about evenly spaced. So now grabbing the top section here, we have to get this top section back in place. And this is going to line up so that each of these little posts goes into one of these slots on this section in here. The other thing that we have to line up here, though, is to make sure that once the top section here goes in place, it has a little screw hole, which was for the aperture control lever. Once that goes in place, the two little bottom slots on that the plate that the blades are sitting on here, those need to line up properly so that the little screw hole for the aperture control ring is lined up with the slot over here. So just looking at this, we have the slot of the aperture control that the aperture control is going to go through over on this side, right there. And then we have the two levers, or the two screws that the diaphragm ring is going to sit on. One is here and one is here. So finding one of the little levers here on this diaphragm piece, it's right over here. So if we position it the same way on the lens, now the slot is over on this side, going like that. We're going to find the little tiny hole over here for the aperture control lever. And it's going to go, there's a post right on top of the lever, or on top of the slot on the ring right here. It's going to go 2 positions over. So the little hole on this is going to go 2 positions over from that to line up properly. So I'm going to see that this is right there, and the hole is right over here on this side, so counterclockwise. And I'm just going to set this down on top of. And not everything is lining up perfectly right at first, but you can nudge these little levers back and forth until they should all snap in place eventually. Okay, so that's looking good. And now if I just slide this off and grab the diaphragm on its own, rotating the diaphragm plate here, just very carefully, and I'm holding it down so that these don't come loose, and making sure to keep it centered. Rotating that plate back and forth, we'll see that the blades are moving back and forth properly. So I'm going to put it at fully open again, and the little hole is also lining up with the mark that I made on this ring originally. So over here is the mark of where the slot was ending. It's lining up with that little hole for the diaphragm control lever. So now comes one of the additional hard parts of the reassembly, is getting this diaphragm assembly back into the lens properly. So the way I found that is easiest to do this is to grab the diaphragm piece with like your thumb and a finger wedged in there like that, and then flip it upside down and make note of where, oh, that's not what you want to do. 1 second. So taking care not to let the back plate go into the wrong position, I'm going to note where the hole is over here for the diaphragm control lever. Just carefully position that on my fingers like that. And now I'm going to grab the piece here, and you can see that the 2 little screw holes are down here and here on either side. And the little mark for where the diaphragm slot is over here is over there, so I know that these 2 are going to line up like this. You can also look from the back of the lens, these 2 screws are going to help with lining these up properly. So just position this correctly and then drop it in place. and then spin it around a little bit until it locks down in place. Then flip it back over, and if you did everything correctly, it should be locked in place. There's nothing holding on the top plate at this point, so be careful not to flip it back over. But now, if you turn this around, and I'm going to hold this in place to where the slot is over here, you should see that little hole that was in the top of the diaphragm mechanism is right on the edge of this slot over there. So to actually get the diaphragm control back in position, I'm going to grab that long post which had the slotted screw at the end and just screw it back in place. This doesn't actually fully lock down the diaphragm as we saw before, so you can still get the blades out of position when you're taking it or when you're putting it back together if you're not careful. So there'll be a few more steps where you have to be careful when you're handling the diaphragm. Now looking at the diaphragm here, if I actually move this little slot back and forth just carefully, the diaphragm will open and close properly. So putting back together the lens here, the next step is that we want to actually get this diaphragm back into its housing so that we don't have to worry about getting the blades out of alignment here. So grabbing this metal piece, which had the kind of grippy section at the top, which is what you were spinning around to control the aperture directly, you can see that there are two little metal parts on the bottom here. One is for the ball bearing right here, so this little pocket is for the ball bearing. And then there's this kind of forked shaped piece, and that is actually what's going to couple into that lever on the diaphragm over there to control it. So we're going to grab the diaphragm and just position the fork shaped piece onto the diaphragm lever there and push these two pieces together. We'll worry about the ball bearing there in a moment. There we go, and you still have to be careful at this stage, but to fix that, we'll then screw in this front optical piece as well. So this goes on top of the piece we just put in place and just screws in place. You can use a spanning wrench to lock this down into two little grooves. Now that this is in place, we don't really have to worry anymore about dislodging the diaphragm blades because this is pretty much how it's going to go into the camera. So if you actually spin this top piece around and the fork is correctly lined up here, then you should see the diaphragm open and close properly. To actually get the ball bearing back in place, the ball bearing is going to go in the pocket right over here. And the easiest way I found to get the ball bearing back in place, rather than trying to do that all in one step and get the ball bearing back in when you're putting the silver section in place, you can actually just remove the metal plate that the ball bearing goes on. So it is going into this metal kind of brass colored section over here with the two slotted screws on this section. So I'll loosen these two up a little bit. You don't need to undo these fully. And once those are loosened up, you can take the ball bearing and just slide it under and into that pocket on the metal piece there. So that looks good. And now I'll tighten one of these down a little bit, and you want to line up the ball bearing with the grooves and the little cutouts so that it can actually be on the correct track and make that clicking sound. You can kind of test it to see if it's lined up properly, and if it's not, kind of edge it up and down until you find the correct alignment. So it looks good. And now I'll tighten down the other screw all the way and make sure the first one's fully tightened down as well. It should make the clicking sound. As I mentioned, this lens is so worn down on mine that it doesn't really make any clicking sound. It kind of stops a little bit, but there's not much of a clicking sound on this copy. Next step is to get this housing back into the main body of the lens in the focusing mechanism here. So looking here, the diaphragm housing has this brass colored ring that's just going to slide onto it. It's kind of a stopper piece. And it just is going to go back into the main lens housing like this. and you want to line it up so that the black indicator, which is indicating what the current aperture is set to, is correctly lined up with the numbers over here. The actual way that this is locked in place, and just because this is fully open at the moment, I'm going to kind of line up the black indicator with 3.5, so maximum aperture. And the way that this is actually locked in place fully is this silver ring. So the silver ring just screws in place, and then the two little slotted screws that were in the silver ring go into these indentations down here and prevent the silver ring from turning around again. So I'll screw in the silver ring first. And looking through the silver ring, you should be able to line it up once it gets tight with one of those two sets of screws on the back section there. So I could actually see that one of the indentations for the screws came into alignment just as it was tightening down fully. And now I'll reinstall the two slotted screws on either side here to lock this silver ring in place and prevent it from turning. And if you did everything correctly, now the diaphragm, when you rotate between the 2 points, minimum and maximum aperture, the numbers and the black indicator should be correctly lined up. So for minimum 22, it's all the way closed, and for maximum 3.5, it's over at 3.5 as well. And finally, here on the front of the lens, we'll just reinstall the name ring. So it screws in place, and used a spanning wrench to just lock this down the rest of the way. And then the last part of the reassembly is to reinstall the mounting plate here. So we have the focusing section right here, and I'm going to focus all the way out on this focusing section so that the brass section is as far separated from the front part here as possible. That just is going to help a little bit with the realignment. And on this focusing piece, you'll notice that there is a red indicator back here, and then there's a little red indicator up here as well. That's going to help with the alignment of these two pieces. So I'm going to align these two red indicators. And if I did that properly, on the set of screw holes on the silver section here should line up with the ones on the brass intersection of the focusing mechanism. So they're aligned right there. And we can actually then lock these two together with the 5 little slotted screws going around those sections. Alright, so that has the reassembly of this lens complete now. You can make sure that everything is working as expected, make sure that the diaphragm is opening and closing properly, and that the focusing and the mounting plates are also lining up as you would expect on this lens. Overall, this is a pretty interesting lens to take apart. It has some challenges, but it's a pretty simple lens in its design. It has very few components and they're all made of metal, so it is something you can repair pretty easily. The diaphragm is really the only complication in that the diaphragm blades tend to fall out of place if you're not careful during the disassembly, and then reassembling the diaphragm because of the size of the diaphragm and also the kind of odd V-shaped blades can be a little bit challenging to put back together, especially if you're not used to reassembling diaphragms on even normal sized lenses. So it is a repairable lens. The one downside obviously is that it can only really be used with a Minolta Super-A camera as well, so that does kind of limit the appeal of repairing this lens, but it is something to kind of an interesting lens to look at historically, and certainly an interesting one to take apart.